The vibration of my phone at 2:17 a.m. didn't just wake me up, it startled me in a way that felt instinctive, like my body knew before my mind did that something wasn't right, and when I reached for the screen in the dark, blinking against the sudden light, I expected to see an alarm, a spam alert, anything except the name of the HOA president glowing calmly at the top like it belonged there. For a moment I convinced myself it had to be an emergency, a broken pipe, a fire, some community-wide issue that justified the hour, but the message itself erased that excuse instantly, short and informal, written the way someone texts a friend, not a resident. "Are you awake?" I stared at it longer than I should have, my thoughts racing through every reason he shouldn't be contacting me like this, every boundary that existed between us on paper, and yet I still replied, telling myself professionalism would steer the conversation back where it belonged. It didn't. His response came almost immediately, and instead of mentioning rules or HOA business, he commented on how late my porch light stayed on, how quiet my house always seemed, how difficult it could be for someone living alone in a community where people didn't really look out for each other anymore. Each sentence felt carefully chosen, wrapped in concern but weighted with familiarity, and by the time I set my phone down, sleep was impossible, replaced by the uneasy awareness that someone with authority had been paying closer attention to my life than I'd realized. Over the next few days, the messages returned, always late, always framed as casual check-ins, never explicit enough to accuse, but personal enough to feel invasive, and I started noticing details I'd never questioned before, like how often he referenced my schedule without asking, how easily he slipped observations about my habits into conversation. I tried to create distance, replying hours later, keeping my responses short and neutral, hoping the lack of engagement would make him move on, but instead his attention seemed to sharpen, shifting from private messages to public authority. While emails began landing in my inbox about inspections I'd never been warned of, notices appeared on my door citing minor violations that had never been enforced before, and during meetings he addressed me directly more often than necessary, his tone polite, his gaze lingering just long enough to make me uncomfortable. Neighbors who used to wave now looked away, conversations fell silent when I walked past, and the sense of isolation grew heavy, like the community itself had subtly rearranged around me. I told myself I was overthinking, that stress was filling in gaps with fear, until one evening I came home to find a formal violation notice taped neatly to my door, claiming an issue that didn't exist, and before I could even unlock the door, my phone buzzed with a message from him saying he'd already seen the problem and could help resolve it quickly. Standing alone in the hallway with the paper shaking in my hand, I felt the first true wave of panic, because I realized the late-night message hadn't been harmless curiosity, it had been a doorway, and by answering it at 2:17 a.m., I had stepped into something I didn't yet understand. From that point on, nothing felt separate anymore, not the messages, not the notices, not the way his presence seemed to follow me through the neighborhood like a shadow that only appeared when I wasn't looking directly at it. I stopped replying to him altogether, hoping silence would restore some sense of control, but instead the pressure tightened, inspections scheduled with barely any notice, warnings escalating quickly, each one paired with a calm, reassuring text offering guidance if I needed help. Navigating the process. The contradiction was unsettling, because the same person creating the stress was positioning himself as the solution, and slowly I began to understand how that dynamic worked, how authority could manufacture problems and then sell relief as kindness. I started paying closer attention to the community around me, noticing how carefully everyone followed the rules, how quickly complaints died down, how often people lowered their voices when discussing the HOA, and when I finally asked a neighbor if enforcement had always been this strict, she hesitated before saying it depended on who you were, then quickly changed the subject. That answer stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I documented everything quietly, saving messages, photographing notices, writing down dates and times, trying to reassure myself that I was being cautious, not paranoid. Late one night, unable to sleep, I searched through publicly available HOA records, expecting nothing more than confirmation that I was imagining patterns, but instead I found names that repeated in unsettling ways, complaints filed and resolved quickly, properties sold soon after, residents, mostly women living alone, who seemed to vanish from the community without explanation. There was nothing overtly criminal, nothing definitive, just absence, and absence can be louder than proof when it repeats often enough. The realization made my stomach knot, because suddenly the message at 2:17 a.m. felt less like a coincidence and more like an introduction, a way of testing availability, compliance, responsiveness, all under the cover of concern. When my phone buzzed again one night at the same exact time, I didn't open it immediately, because I already knew what it would contain. Not rules, not fines, but that same familiar blend of attention and pressure that had been tightening around my life for weeks. Sitting in the dark with the screen lighting up my hands, I finally accepted the truth I'd been avoiding. The boundary hadn't been crossed accidentally, it had been measured, and the system that enforced order in this community was flexible when it came to power, and rigid only when it came to resistance. By answering that first message, I hadn't started a conversation, I had been identified, observed, and quietly positioned, and as the phone continued to vibrate in my hand, I understood that what came next wouldn't be about rules at all, but about how far control could reach once it knew you were listening. The first time he spoke to me in person about something that wasn't officially HOA business, it felt almost gentle, so carefully phrased that I nearly convinced myself I'd misjudged everything, and that was what scared me most, because manipulation never announces itself, it settles in quietly and makes you doubt your own instincts. He caught me one afternoon near the mailbox, smiling like we were old friends, apologizing for all the recent inspections, blaming board pressure, legal obligations, things beyond his control, and when I nodded without responding, he leaned closer and lowered his voice, telling me he worried about how isolated I seemed, how stress could break people down when they didn't have someone looking out for them. That was when the tone shifted, not threatening, not romantic, but intimate in a way that felt deliberate, and before I could step back, he reminded me that compliance issues could escalate quickly if misunderstandings weren't resolved, his words calm while the meaning behind them tightened around my chest. Over the following weeks, the HOA pressure eased slightly, just enough to make relief feel real, and I hated myself for feeling grateful, for noticing how peaceful the house felt when the notices stopped coming, for understanding exactly what he wanted me to understand without him ever saying it out loud. His messages changed too, less frequent, more personal, asking about my day, commenting on things he couldn't possibly know unless he'd been paying attention, and when I didn't respond, the inspections quietly returned, precise and targeted, never enough to be outrageous, always enough to remind me of the balance I was expected to maintain. Neighbors grew distant, not hostile, just unavailable, like people who knew that involvement came with consequences, and when I tried to explain what was happening to someone I trusted, the words sounded thin, paranoid, easy to dismiss, because nothing he did crossed a clear legal line. The realization hit slowly and painfully. This wasn't obsession, it was conditioning, a cycle of pressure and relief designed to teach me where safety came from and how easily it could be taken away. One night, after weeks of silence from me, I received another message at 2:17 a.m., different from the others, warmer, almost affectionate, telling me he didn't want conflict, that he felt a connection he couldn't ignore, that people like us were misunderstood in communities that valued appearances over truth. Reading it, I understood how carefully he'd layered this moment, fear first, then familiarity, then the suggestion of something that looked like care but functioned as control, and as I set the phone down, my hands shaking, I realized the horror wasn't that he wanted me, it was that he wanted my compliance disguised as consent. Once I saw the shape of the trap, I stopped reacting emotionally and started preparing quietly, knowing that resistance couldn't be loud or sudden without consequences I wasn't ready to face. I played neutral, polite but distant, responding just enough to keep the pressure from spiking while documenting everything, screenshots saved, dates logged, patterns mapped, and the clearer the system became, the more terrifying its simplicity felt. The HOA rules weren't weapons on their own, they were tools, flexible in the hands of someone who understood how fear worked, how isolation worked, how people could be erased without violence, without noise, just paperwork and patience. When I finally confronted him, carefully and privately, telling him his messages were inappropriate and made me uncomfortable, his expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened, as if a switch had flipped behind them, and his voice softened into something almost sympathetic as he reminded me how easily situations could be misunderstood, how complaints without proof had a way of turning back on the person who made them, and how exhausting it could be to fight a system designed to protect itself. That conversation marked the end of the illusion, because afterward the kindness vanished completely and was replaced by efficiency, inspections scheduled back to back, violations escalating faster, deadlines shortened, legal language appearing where warnings used to be, and I understood then that love had never been the goal, it had been the leash. The final message arrived earlier than usual, not at 2:17 a.m. but just after sunset, telling me he'd done everything he could, that the board's patience was gone, that some residents simply weren't a good fit for the community, and reading it I felt something steady replace the fear, because I finally saw the choice he was offering me and refused to take it. I sent my documentation to multiple outside parties at once, housing authorities, legal aid groups, journalists who specialized in HOA abuse, creating a trail that couldn't be quietly buried or rewritten, and when questions started coming back, not to me but to the HOA itself, the community shifted in subtle ways, meetings postponed, notices paused, his car no longer parked on my street at night. Weeks later, as I packed my belongings and closed the door on that house for the last time, it wasn't defeat I felt but relief, because I hadn't been erased, I hadn't been silenced, and sometimes even now, when I wake suddenly and check the time, my body still expecting a vibration that no longer comes, and see 2:17 glowing on the clock, I remind myself that the message meant to test my obedience ended up teaching me the truth about power, control, and how easily order becomes a weapon when no one is watching.